Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the June edition, if you like, of the NSA's Breakfast Club. It's a glorious morning across the whole of the UK, I think. So for those that are able to join us, thanks very much, and hopefully it won't be we won't take up too much of your time before you can get back out to do what you need to do, whether that's shearing or even considering cutting grass. I don't know, but yeah, we'll try and get this wrapped up in about an hour and a quarter. So. Yeah, my name's Phil Stocker. I'm the Chief Executive of the National Sheep Association, and this morning's Breakfast Club is going to allow us to delve into that very complex world of sustainability and how we assess sustainability on our farms. In terms of sustainability on a global platform, I guess we know that climate change and carbon is right up there at the top of the agenda. And we've had carbon footprinting tools for somewhere in the region of 15 years now. They've not always done us any great favors in the beef and sheep sectors, I guess. You know, when I remember 15 years ago when we first started to see attempts at carbon footprinting, they painted the sheep sector in a particularly bad light, and it wasn't long before we realized that one of the problems there that they weren't necessarily very complete in what they were assessing. You know, at that time they're still not really effectively taken into consideration carbon sequestration that happens with our grassland or other habitats on the farm. And the whole subject of methane at that time was very controversial, and we really welcomed the work that came from Oxford University just over a year ago, which started to look at GWP star with a recognition that methane was a far shorter cycle gas than CO2 and nitrous oxide as well. So, you know, things have moved on in the world of carbon footprinting, but the more we've got into complete carbon footprinting, I think the more it's raised questions over the fact that maybe sustainability isn't all about carbon and climate change alone. You know, it is also about nature, and you know, it won't be a surprise to anyone that nature recovery is up there, almost as high up the agenda as climate change is at the moment. But animal welfare as well, the protection of natural capital, soils, air, and our water, social sustainability, and then of course let's not forget economic sustainability, because for anything to be sustainable in today's world, it has to be economically sustainable as well. So that is leading everyone to nudge towards broader, more holistic sustainability assessments, I think. And this morning's panel of speakers, we've got three people who I think you know, are going to really set this morning alight, if that's not putting too much pressure on you. But you know, I think we're in for a really interesting session. But we've got Jonathan Foote, the environment manager from AHDB, who's going to give us an overview of what's going on in carbon footprinting. We've got Adele Jones from the Sustainable Food Trust, who's going to be going through some work that they're doing on wider sustainability assessments. And Adele is involved with some DEFRA ELMS test and trial work as well. And we've also got Priscilla Williams from Bangor University, and you know, Priscilla and Bangor have been doing some really good work on carbon footprinting tools and just broaden that out as well. Bangor was one of the sustainable intensification platforms that was part of the DEFRA research work a few years ago. So he's been involved in this work for quite some time. We then got a very small panel of two active NSA members, Greg Dalton from way up in the wilds of the Pennines in north of England, and then Kevin Harrison from my part of the world, really, is that much softer, calmer world of of the West Country. So let's kick off this morning by welcoming John Foote. I'll hand over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen with you and put up the presentation. So it's fantastic to be with you all today, and especially on such a glorious day. So I'm going to start by just outlining a bit of the background, why this is important, and then get to the sort of meat of the topic. And I think everybody has seen in the news the sort of campaigns by the public, by activists, and a range of sort of groups about, you know, changing the diets and tackling climate change. And this is actually really, I believe, going to drive the agenda around climate change, reporting of data, carbon footprinting, the way that information is fed through to the sort of retailer, far faster than any of the legislation, because you can see the pressure coming down through the supply chain and through the financial institutions. And why is this important for agriculture? Well, you know, about just under 10% of the footprint comes for the UK comes from agriculture. About 6% of that is from the livestock sector, and the predominant sort of greenhouse gas, as was mentioned, is methane, and again that comes from livestock and the management of manures. There is some associated with waste management. And what you can see, if you look at the black line at the top, you can see that overall emissions have reduced since the 1990s when the baseline was set, but it's flatlined in more recent years. And in fact, I think the latest data is showing a slight uptick of the numbers as, you know, productivity has changed and more product has been produced. So, you know, we're at odds with what's happening in the rest of the UK economy, where we've seen significant reductions. The energy industry, for example, was 50% of that overall footprint and has come down to 25%. So if we do nothing as an industry, then we're going to look worse relative to everything else. And that position will continue to look worse as everybody else works to reduce and decarbonize. So we can't stand still, and we can't stand still because our peers internationally are also going to be doing activity to reduce their overall carbon footprint. And that's really important when we're looking at trade deals and looking to export our product. We'd like to see carbon border taxes in the future. And, you know, if our sheep meat is higher than that of New Zealand or Australia, then you'll end up paying a tariff on that, and that'll make you uncompetitive. Now, there's a lot driving this, but, you know, certainly we're seeing from the UK Climate Change Committee, they published a report in December last year that they expect that land use change will drive a lot of opportunity to lock up or protect carbon in the landscape. So, you know, in terms of sheep farming, you've got large areas of peat, and the best thing we can do there is, you know, protect those areas, make sure they're wetted up, they're not overgrazed, etc. Conversely, in lowland areas where maybe you've had sheep in the past, you've got the opposite problem where you know, they're undergrazed, and you know, you've then got scrub encroachment. So there's a lot to be done, and we'll see money coming through the ELMS or the Sustainable Farming Incentive to support those. The government wants to increase the amount of trees planted, but, you know, it's got to be the right trees in the right place. You know, I've been involved with wind farms where they planted crops of conifers on them, they drained the peat, and 35 years later, the trees were shorter than I am. So, you know, quite clearly they've damaged that peatland, and you know, we've got an uneconomic crop of trees there. So it's making sure we've got the sort of forestry in the right places. They want to do a lot around changing diets, and this is where there is a significant sort of threat to the industry in terms of what the government wants to do. You know, they want to reduce the consumption of red meat and dairy products by 20% by 2030 and increase that further to 35% by 2050. And for the government, this is a win-win situation because they can, you know, improve the health of the UK population and deliver greenhouse gas reductions, and especially in terms of methane, where, you know, if you hammer the sort of methane early, regardless if you're using GWP or GWP star, sorry, then you can see a much faster cooling effect by taking that action early. So we have got a significant sort of threat to the industry there, which we are working to support the industry. And as was hinted at by Phil, you know, we have large amounts of carbon that aren't fully accounted for in the carbon tools. And, you know, it can be quite significant amounts of carbon under, you know, unimproved grassland or even just improved grassland of 83 tonnes per hectare. And if you look at the woodland there, you know, you've got 66 tonnes of carbon per hectare, although you've got a similar amount of above ground carbon in mature woodland. The really big winner here is peatland, where you've got 259 tonnes per hectare. So again, locking that carbon up in that sort of peatland is, you know, a massive saving, and we've got large areas. So, you know, we do need to make sure the tools are accounting for those carbon stocks and what we're continuing to add or protect. But it's also going to be done in perpetuity. So, you know, some of these systems, especially if you look at the arable cropping, you're going to knock the carbon out within a few months. And all right, there's a cycling process, adding and losing carbon. But overall, that particular system, you're losing you know, more carbon from that system compared to some of the grassland ones. So we need to make sure that tools are accounting for carbon stocks in the soil and in other sort of environmental sort of natural capital sort of opportunities like hedgelands, woods, and other sort of features that you may have on your land. And at the moment, the tools just don't do that at all, or they do it in a very sort of broad brush way that is not great. And the other speakers will be talking more about that. I suppose it's also worth saying that the majority of UK grasslands, especially the unimproved ones, are already at the maximum holding capacity. So if you think of the grassland as being that system with the soil being a sponge, you keep adding water to it, you know, there's only so much water that sponge can hold, and they're pretty much at that in some cases. If you then do something to the management of that land, then you can, it's in effect squeezing the sponge, and you can, you know, you lose some of that carbon from the soil and from the grassland. So, you know, again, there may not be much opportunity to increase carbon stocks, but, you know, what we would want to see is, you know, you being rewarded for maintaining those carbon stocks and sort of protecting that. So what are we doing to help levy payers? Well, we're building a range of tools to support the sort of levy payer, and all of you will be levy payers for the sheep industry. So if you look at the diagram on the top right hand side, you can see 3 levels. So number 1, we're looking at having some KPIs, you know, stuff that on a day-to-day basis really helps you with the performance on your farm. And we're trying to make those as easy as possible. So for example, we're looking at, you know, how much feed have you purchased? How much fertilizer have you purchased? So you can look at invoices and use that to sort of derive a proxy. And the tool we're providing will then give you more information back in terms of your feed conversion ratio, an indication of whether or not your carbon footprint is good or bad, and where you are maybe against your peers. And we see that as an introductory level. Now, we've also been running some work on our Farm Excellence platform, and we've got a number of sheep farms. I think there's about 6 this year involved in that. And we've been supporting farmers to complete those audit tools. Now, we're well aware that, you know, there are multiple tools out there on the market, and, you know, they all give you different answers depending on which way the wind's blowing. None of them are, you know, 100% accurate, but they are very good for helping you to sort of understand where the biggest pots of carbon are on your farm, and for you to then use those on a consistent basis year in, year out. So even if the numbers are incorrect in absolute terms, if you use the same tool over a period of time, the differences you see between when you undertake those assessments will be genuine. And it just enables you to see where the hotspots are on those farms, and then to start thinking about where you can, you know, develop an action plan to improve your performance. And I would say both with the KPIs and that carbon tool, that at the end of the day, it's money. It's, you know, follow the money. That's where the biggest carbon savings are. That's where you're going to make money for your farm. And we have seen from work that we've been doing through this that actually productivity is probably the biggest driver. You know, making sure your animals are fit and healthy, making sure you have a robust nutrient management plan, that you are, you know, you've got the right sort of feed if you're adding supplementary feed, you manage your grasslands to reduce wastage and optimize the growth of that grass. And so, you know, there's nothing revolutionary, it's not rocket science, but it's just doing everything well, and that, you know, drives both your income, but at the same time, it delivers the best carbon benefits. We're also looking at developing EnviroBench, which will be linked up to the UK National Inventory, and we see that as being the gold standard that will enable us to demonstrate that the industry as a whole is improving, and we can use that to support the industry's reputation, We can use it to sort of work with retailers to sort of enable them to have confidence in data, and it will link through to all of the existing tools in the market. Underpinning all of that is entitled here the Evidence for Farming Initiative, but really that's a way of getting to the latest information, innovation, and best practice, and sort of embedding that on your farm. So we're looking at using evidence and data to really drive the industry and to support the industry's reputation. And that, you may say, well, why is that important? Well, if you, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the campaign that we've been running. It's the Eat Balance campaign. It's about eating a balanced diet that includes red meat, it includes dairy, it includes fruit and vegetables. But we play very heavily on the benefits that meat and dairy bring to the diet. We talk about the sustainability of the product and the fact that, you know, we have some of the best meat in the world, along with some of the lowest carbon footprints. So we're out there talking about that and sort of driving that agenda. And last year we went head to head with Veganery on that. I've got to say we received a lot of flack and abuse, both personally, but also as an organisation. But it's something that we feel needs to be done because there is a lot of incorrect information out there, especially in social media. We have developed bots that then are able to answer questions that people may be asking in terms of, you know, is meat bad for the environment? And we're able to provide evidence-based information back to them, and we then point them to sort of towards third parties, which are independent of us and others, just to give a fair view of what's happening. So that's been, you know, those campaigns you're paying for, but they've been really successful, and we've had, you know, a lot of positive feedback around those. And then just lastly from me, we're going to be talking a lot about carbon, and Phil touched on this, but carbon is not the only measure out there, and we need to be thinking about how do we provide data that can be then fed through the supply chain to the consumer ultimately, so the consumer can make informed choices. We shouldn't use carbon as the only proxy for good environmental performance, because if you do that, then no matter how good the sort of sheep production system is, you will lose the debate against some of the sort of plant-based sort of alternatives, because they, of course, have a lower sort of day-to-day footprint. But if you start to then look at some of these sort of plant-based products on a wider basis, and you look at pollution, you look at, you know, water security and where the water's coming from, or you look at impacts on biodiversity, and look at those holistically, then some of these things start to look less good. And so, for example, avocados, which is an example that I've put up there, you know, they're produced in Mexico, California, and other areas where water is in short supply. And we're basically exporting the water from Mexico to the UK to sort of produce a very nice product. But, you know, is it as sustainable as a sheep that's sat in the Welsh uplands in near horizontal rain, followed by vertical rain, and has been fed on, you know, natural grass for its life? And the answer is no. And so, you know, it's making sure we've got that balance of information. We can find ways of presenting it to the consumer, so that the consumer, when they're looking at, you know, a plant-based alternative to meat or dairy, can go, yeah, I'm happy to buy that. And it's to give the consumer the confidence that they're making the right choices. So, you know, whatever we do, we've got to have that information and that data to feed through the supply chain. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much, John. That was an excellent start. I'll pass straight over to Adele. Adele, can you...
Absolutely. Is that, can you see my screen okay?
That looks very good. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, let's get this going. Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to be here today. My name's Adele Jones. I'm Deputy CEO of the Sustainable Food Trust. The Sustainable Food Trust, for anyone that doesn't know, is a small UK-based charity, but we also have an international focus, and we work on accelerating the transition towards more sustainable food and farming systems. And John, I feel like you set me up quite nicely at the end of your conversation to talk about measuring whole farm sustainability, and obviously carbon being really important as part of that conversation, but perhaps not the only measure that we should be focusing on going forward. So I mean, just to kind of, you know, tee this up a little bit and think about why this is really important right now. And John's mentioned a couple of these factors already, but I think there's three main reasons why measuring whole farm sustainability is incredibly important for farmers to be thinking about doing now. The first one is Brexit and the new farm support schemes. They're going to look quite different to what currently exists, BPS and agri-environment. The second factor is what John was talking about, with pressure from consumers, particularly young people now, starting to want to know a little bit more about where their food comes from. And I think we have a collective job as an industry to tell the stories of, you know, why British produce, why British meat, lamb, beef can actually be part of the solution. And I do think there's a huge opportunity there to influence these people who are starting to want to eat in a more sustainable or climate friendly way. We just, I think, need to do better at telling those stories. So that's the second factor. And the third factor is that every company, or almost every company in government now, has a net zero strategy, which they need to figure out how to reach, i.e. how they are going to become climate neutral by 2030, 2040, 2050, whenever they've set their deadline for. But obviously Phil at the beginning mentioned the, you know, economic sustainability being really important here. And so I just wanted to start by saying that we have to ensure that the best business case is to farm in this way, which is part of the climate change nature recovery solution. And so, you know, this is a really crude slide that shows roughly where farmers get their income from at the moment. You've roughly 50 BPS agri-environment, 50%, and 50% agriculture, the products you produce. And I think going forward, and again, this is a really crude representation, but going forward, I think that the funding streams are going to look a little more different. And I think the new government schemes will obviously, hopefully provide income still, albeit in a slightly different way, whatever they end up looking like. Obviously, the food you produce, the commodities you produce, will continue to provide income. But there's also this sort of new bubble which is floating around, which is private sector funding opportunities, i.e. those companies who themselves have a net zero strategy, and they need to work out whether or not they can reach that net zero strategy by influencing, let's say, the suppliers who they're sourcing from, whether it's Tesco or Sainsbury's, by trying to incentivize their producers to move in a more sustainable direction, or potentially through these kind of new carbon offset schemes which are coming our way, which we definitely need to approach with caution, I add. But I do think there's some really interesting opportunities for farmers here if we get it right, and if we're thinking about funding this change in a holistic way rather than just focusing on carbon as a single issue. So this graph here is disclaimer, a little bit out of date. It's 2016 graph from a Green Alliance report, but I think it's really interesting. It's showing the carbon offset activities back in 2016, and you can see there's a big bubble for renewables. There's a big bubble for reduced deforestation, tree planting. Efficient cooking stoves was it's kind of a surprisingly high offset activity there. But you can see on the left-hand side, on the vertical axis there's a little tiny dot for grassland management. And as John described, permanent pastures, well-managed grassland may not have huge potential to increase their carbon stocks. But there's a huge amount of carbon already stored in those grasslands, which farmers should effectively be paid to maintain, whether it's through the new government schemes or through these private sector schemes. If you think about the fact that grassland represents the second largest carbon store after the oceans, i.e. soils represent the second largest carbon store after the oceans. So much more carbon in our global soils than in the atmosphere. There's a huge opportunity there for farmers to be paid to maintain and potentially grow their carbon stocks. And obviously, in the UK, we're a country of predominantly grassland, and so I think the maintenance of those carbon stocks potentially will form a really important part of farm income going forward. And there are obviously things you can do to increase your carbon stocks, but also the biodiversity of your farm or landscape. You know, for example, planting legumes into a rotation, some agroforestry, cover cropping. There's quite a big opportunity when you convert arable to grass, because arable soils tend to be a little more degraded, or a lot more degraded in some circumstances. So if you're converting that into grass, either as permanent pasture or as part of a rotation, there is quite a lot of opportunity there to build your organic matter and organic carbon. So there's definitely things farmers can start doing to be part of this change and become part of the solution, a lot of which many of you are already doing, and you need to be rewarded for doing those things. But in order to get paid for any of these things, and obviously there's a much longer list. This is just a small subset of things, activities that farmers can do. We need to understand where we're starting from. And then based on where we're starting from, we can get a better idea of where we're going over time. And measuring that, what we call baseline data, where we're starting from, is going to be incredibly important if you're going to be able to access some of these new funding streams going forward. So I just want to sort of acknowledge the fact that farmers are already subjected to multiple different overlapping audits. This is a graphic which shows just actually a tiny part of a much bigger image. So there's thousands of different accreditation schemes, now lots of different carbon footprinting tools, compliance audits. Obviously there's your current BPS and stewardship applications. There's so much that farmers are already doing in terms of supplying information to different people for market access reasons, or for accessing funding from the government, or for voluntary, just putting information into your farm management software if you use those things. So rather than reinvent the wheel, we put the challenge back to farmers, and this is about 5 years ago now. We convened a group of farmers in the UK and said to them, look, what do you already measure on farm? Are any of those things useful? Do they actually help you make more informed management decisions, or are they just sort of tick boxing exercises? And the sort of resounding answer from this group, which included a whole representation of different farm scales and enterprises, was that they were just tick boxing exercises. We do our red tractor audit because we have to. We do our cool farm tool assessment because, I don't know, Nestle says that we have to do it in order to provide milk to them. And so we started to think, okay, is there a better way which we can give this challenge back to the farmers and say, okay, what do you guys think you should be measuring and reporting on, and how? And let's not start from the beginning. Let's look at the best bits of things that you already do and start to compile what we were calling at the time a harmonized framework for measuring whole farm sustainability. So this includes productivity, so economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and social sustainability. So taking a very much holistic whole farm approach. And over the period of 5 years, this framework has continued to evolve. We've had more feedback from farmers. We've been testing this on the ground as well as having workshops. And this is what we're now calling this global farm metric, because we believe that there needs to be a common framework for measuring on-farm sustainability, which any farmer across the world could use and that could effectively speak in the same language. So very simplistically, you could compare it to the financial accounting standards, in that there's an independent body or a few independent bodies which set a set of standards for managing financial accounts. There's then a whole host of different ways to actually audit your accounts. You can do it yourself, you can use an app, you can use an auditor, you can use a management accountant, but they're all using the same framework and the same language, which makes any account comparable no matter what the scale or your situation. And that's what we think is now needed for on-farm sustainability, so that we can start to capture information about carbon, biodiversity, animal welfare, social and human capital. Social capital is basically the impact on your community. Human capital is the impact of people on your farm, positive or negative. and start to capture this in a common way as kind of an umbrella framework rather than just becoming another audit on your farm. So effectively, we think the global farm metric could be used to drive continuous improvement on farm, but that it's not just another audit, it's something which can take information from things that farmers are already doing, like your red tractor, your leaf, your cool farm tool, whatever it is that you might be using on your farm. And it can encourage those certifiers or carbon footprint tools to collect that information in a common way. And that common information can then be sent off to all the various people who need to see it, either for compliance, market access, or funding reasons. So obviously there's the new government schemes. We're suggesting that this should be a prerequisite for entering into ELM and the equivalents in the devolved nations. And some of you in Wales will know that the Welsh Government have committed to introduce an annual sustainability assessment called the Farm Sustainability Review, which will be based on this framework, which is fantastic. We're still sort of pushing at DEFRA to do the same, which is what we've been testing through our ELM test and trial for the last couple of years. But it could be used to inform the new government schemes, or at least give government a better idea of where public goods are being delivered on farm, and therefore whether or not it's a good use of taxpayers' money, which we obviously know it is, or we very much hope that it is. But I think the Treasury are going to need that backup data to be able to maintain the budget for farming, because I think there's a real risk that it will go down. For food companies, for sourcing policies and potentially transparency for customers. If customers are being told about sustainability in a common way, it's going to make it a lot less confusing for them, and also allow them to see the carbon impact perhaps next to the nature impact, and perhaps next to the the well-being aspect of what farmers deliver. And actually that gives them a much more complete picture. And as John was saying, avocados, they might be they might have lower carbon emissions because they don't produce methane, but probably the nature impact is quite degrading, and the impact on water is not great. So looking at things in that more holistic way is going to be really important. Investors looking to whether it's offset or invest in what they call natural capital, so or the landscape around us, to be able to drive towards net zero. Banks, for example, are thinking about this now, because if you take out a loan from your bank and you can prove that you're going in that direction of sustainability, they may give you preferential treatment in terms of interest rates on your loans and these sorts of things. So there's all sorts of levers that are going to start to be pulled to help you all drive in this direction. But in order to do that successfully, we need to all be using common metrics and language. And this is broadly what it looks like on farm when you do the self-assessment. This is what we've been doing for our ELM test and trial. So the further out to the green, the higher your score, which allows you to get a really good sense of how you're doing across the whole farm. And these are the organisations we're really pleased to be working with as part of this coalition now. We launched the Global Farm Metric Coalition earlier this year. It's building support quite rapidly. It was a very hard sell 5 years ago, and surprisingly now I think everyone realises that it is actually needed quite desperately. So we're working at great speed at the moment to try and make this happen. But we need more feedback from farmers. We need to know what you want to be measuring and why, and then from that encourage all these organisations to do the same. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you very much, Adele. Some very detailed information there, and a lot of forward-thinking ideas as well. So thank you very much indeed. Priestor, can we pass straight on to you, and then hopefully we'll have a chunk of time for questions and discussion.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Share screen. There we go. Okay, you can see the slides. Okay, yes, Phil?
Yeah, that looks good.
Yep, okay. Yeah, okay, thank you. Right, yes, good morning, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this event. There's some really interesting points from both John and Adele there, and we've preempted some of my slides, which is great, really, so we can spend a bit more time on on others. So yes, Adele made some really good points there, finishing off on how we measure sustainability, what is the measure of sustainability, the dangers of being almost single-minded, sort of blindly going into considering carbon and nothing else, and there are trade-offs. So, you know, having said that, my talk is predominantly going to be on carbon, but I will touch on other things as well. So yes, Adele and John have both mentioned the significant pressure on the livestock sector more broadly now to reduce its environmental impacts, because customers are asking for it, retailers are demanding it potentially, and governments are exploring measures to reduce consumption. I've got a few slides from a Welsh perspective, but they're not unique to Wales at all. We very much know the direction of travel that Welsh governments are heading in terms of future payments and future schemes and so on. There's a lot of detail we don't know, but we most definitely know the direction of travel from the 3 consultations that we've recently had. So it's about payments for public goods, natural capital, you know, to use the jargon and so on, but very different territory to where we've been for decades. And you know, it is going to be pushing, well, some quite challenging questions, but also some opportunities, we'd like to think. But of course, the industry, if you like, is pushing this itself as well. So in December, we had Hybci Cymru Meat Promotion Wales, the Red Meat Levy Board in Wales produced the Welsh Way. And as you can see, it's got a pretty grand subtitle there, towards global leadership in sustainable lamb and beef production. So it's all very well and good saying this, but we obviously need to be able to prove it. And of course, we've also got to remember that almost everybody is at this game now, whether we look at the Irish red meat sector on the left. You know, they've had ambitious plans in place for many years now. They probably were amongst the forerunners in moving on this on any sort of meaningful scale. Australian Levy Board, Meat and Livestock Australia, they've pledged to be carbon neutral in just 9 years' time, which is highly ambitious, but that's their pledge. Whilst the New Zealand sector is essentially saying that they are there already in terms of being carbon neutral, or nearly there already. So they came out with a big report back in October, and you know, it made some quite sort of eye-catching headlines, to be honest. So this isn't, and I think sometimes you speak to farmers and they think, I was speaking to a neighbour last night as it happens, and he was saying, I can't understand why, you know, there's so much emphasis on this. And he was very much thinking that it's only here in the UK or in Wales where there's talk about reducing environmental impacts and so on. But no, it's not unique to us at all, and you know, the major competitors are at it as well. I'm not going to go into this into a great level of detail, but we know that these are the 3 big greenhouse gases that we talk about from livestock systems, and each of them has a different strength, what we call global warming potential. And Phil made the point at the beginning that this debate about whether methane is as strong a greenhouse gas as has been perceived in the past. But you know, if no buts, you know, it does contribute to global warming. So these are the big 3, if you like. Where do they come from? Well, CO2 primarily from the burning of fossil fuels. Methane, of course, from ruminants, and nitrous oxide from fertilizer and manures. So that is inputs of nitrogen into soil, and then bacteria in soil drive processes that ultimately release some of the nitrogen applied in the form of nitrous oxide. So we have been doing work, as Phil said at the beginning, actually, we've been doing work in Bangor on carbon footprinting for many years now, actually. You know, we've worked especially in the livestock sector, I would say. We've worked in a whole range of other sectors as well, but we've been particularly active in the sector for many years now. So we've got a fairly good idea what drives carbon footprints and hopefully how to reduce them as well. So I'm sure many of the people watching and listening this morning would have a good idea what is involved when we conduct the carbon footprints, but we'll just go through it very briefly. So if this was your sheep farm, we look at all the inputs, as John mentioned at the beginning, the tonnage of concentrate, the amount of fertilizers applied, the different types of fertilizers applied, the number of livestock, electricity usage, and so on. And then we can essentially add up the totals of the three big greenhouse gases, or the most relevant greenhouse gases. We essentially clock up or add up the totals from all the different inputs. We look at the farm system itself, so the number of livestock, whether some are sold at stores, whether they are finished, and so on. So the system in the middle, if you like, and of course the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the system itself. So the inputs, be they on the farm or before they've arrived at the farm, what we call upstream emissions. So the fertilizer that might have been manufactured in Eastern Europe and then shipped over here to be used on a farm, we would count those upstream emissions and of course the emissions that happen on the farm from the usage of that fertilizer as well. So those are the inputs, if you like, and the greenhouse gases associated with those inputs and the system itself. And of course we look at the outputs as well. So we look at the weight of lambs finished, whether sheep are sold for breeding or for culling and so on. And essentially we divide the inputs, so that the sums of greenhouse gases, we divide those by the sum of the outputs. So we can then work out the kilograms of greenhouse gases, or what we call CO2 equivalents per kilogram of product. And also, of course, we can work out the total carbon emissions, or per hectare, if you like, for that farm. So that's essentially what's involved. There are many, many different tools out there, as we've heard already. Some, it's fair and true to say, are more accurate than others. They're always going to be estimates, no matter which tool you use, they are going to be an estimate. But there are some tools that are much more detailed than others. And I'm always asked the question, which tool is best? It's a question that I get asked all the time, and I would sit on the fence when I give an answer, because I would say it depends on the purpose. So whether you want to hone in on the nitty-gritty, very, very fine detail, or actually, are we more interested in the general direction of travel? Are we moving in the right direction or not? I think there's a danger sometimes about obsessing with numbers, and because carbon footprints are always an estimate, there's always a big pinch of salt that's needed when interpreting carbon footprint results. The direction of travel is as important as anything, really. And also, of course, the more detailed the carbon footprints, the more faith we have in the results, but they are more onerous. There's more work to do, because there are more boxes to fill, if you like, in terms of the information required to feed into the tools. But of course, what you put in will influence what you get out. The carbon footprint is only as good as the data provided in the first place. And some farmers are on a very different point with all this. I would say, I deal a lot directly with farmers, and some of them are really pushing the boundaries on really wanting to get to grips with their carbon emissions and so on. Others are sort of on the journey, to use that cliche. They're on the bus, so to speak, and others aren't at the bus stop even. Okay, they're driving around the town, maybe looking for the bus stop. So we've got, a huge range of difference in terms of awareness and where we're going. So we're not on a sort of level platform, and there's a lot of work to be done. So ultimately, no matter which tool you use, you should get a report at the end that will provide you with a detail of your emissions and opportunities to offset emissions. detailed KPIs and use of statistics and so on, and hopefully, you know, identify outliers as well. So where there could be, you know, real issues that, you know, could make a big difference. So we've done, briefly go through this, we've done a lot of work, as I say, over the years. We've worked with 20 farms from across Wales just last year, actually, that represented a big diversity of production systems that represent what we have in the UK. Not unique to Wales, they were typical of what we would find in much of the UK: hill, upland, lowland, big, small, and so on. Usually, or mostly, a mixture of beef and sheep. And we use this economic allocation approach. Especially where we do have these mixed systems, if you want to work out the carbon footprint of your lamb separate to the carbon footprint of your beef, we have to find a way of allocating the carbon costs and the carbon offsets as well, and we do this through the economic allocation. So we got these farmers to fill in the Bangor University tools questionnaire, if you like, really long established. It's been updated many times over the years. As the science progresses, the tools should progress as well. And essentially, we got these farmers to provide the information, you know, mentioned earlier on about inputs and outputs and length of hedgerows that they have and so on. And ultimately, we were able to estimate the net emissions, if you like, the cost and the gains of carbon. And what we found was, for just showing this one graph for the hill farms, we had 11 hill farms take part, and some of those hill farmers were disappointed that they were, you know, at the sort of higher end, if you like. They had, their lamb had the highest carbon footprint, or was the highest, and others were pleasantly surprised. And, you know, quite a few of them were surprised to see that the carbon footprint of farm number 11 there was not far off double what it was for farm number 1. So, you know, we often use average values, don't we, and even global average values, which fill me with lots of feelings, to be honest with you. I think the averages hide so much real valuable information, and you know, it's unpicking why farm 11, you know, that was a hill farm, farm number 1 is a hill farm. So understanding why these differences exist rather than lumping them all together, and the averages just hide so much useful information. And not going to explain this in big detail, but just to reiterate the points made earlier, really, that peach colour there is the proportion of total emissions due to methane, and the grey is the proportion of total emissions due to nitrous oxide. So those two are the big factors. Electricity contribution was less than 1%. You can see on the pie chart at the top, maybe it comes out at 0 due to rounding up. You know, if we're doing this on a dairy farm or a pig farm or a poultry farm where electricity usage is much higher, then obviously the results would be different. So yeah, I'll skip straight on to sequestration. So as I said, we looked at an estimated sequestration happening on these farms as well, and some very obvious results came out. That dark green is what we estimated was happening in terms of sequestration in the soil. Sequestration in the soil should be taken, you know, there are many caveats. It's at best going to be an estimate, and I think there's a bit of a sort of perception almost amongst some farmers that, oh, we're grass based, we're fine. You know, we don't buy in much concentrates, we're grass based, we're fine. That isn't necessarily the case at all. We're not sure in many cases. There's a lot of things that can influence sequestration in the soil. Just the blue, that refers to sequestration in trees, and we found some of the farms, you know, trees made a big difference to sequestration, and not on others because they didn't have many trees in the first place. Okay, so coming to the end now, really, are we there in terms of net zero? From the 20 farms that we worked with, no, we're not. We're not close to getting there really, based on the footprints that we estimated. So there you go. I said about averages and mean values, hiding a lot of useful information, but I have used mean values there. So hill farms were sequestering, we estimated they were sequestering about 24% of what they were emitting. Upland and lowland farms were obviously a bit different, but you can see the range in values on the right hand side was quite considerable. So no farm was at net zero. One farm was actually close, but all farms had scope to improve. And how are we going to do all of this? Everybody's asking us to do it. The industry is pushing itself to do it. You know, Welsh Government ambitions is 2050. The NFE want to do it by 2040. So ultimately, we need to reduce emissions in the first place, and to enhancing sequestration. Every answer essentially can be slotted into one of those two boxes, and there are different answers for different farms. It might be, you know, technology that we're not even is not commercially available now. It might be years away in terms of research and development. And there is a lot of promise, but there's a lot that can be done now. And John made these points very well. It's about managing inputs and outputs, so being efficient. And you know, there's a long list there, and they make financial sense in almost all cases. So they are no-brainers really. So that photo on the bottom right is most definitely not a tractor cab that I'm familiar with all these gadgets and so on. But you know, I'm not one to obsess about technology. I think there's a lot of basic things, such as what this chap in the top photo is doing, which is soil testing. There's a lot of basic things that, you know, we can do much better, I think, and let's not be blinded by technology and high-tech answers when we can do a lot of the basics better. And then, yes, the other answer, as I say, is enhancing sequestration. There's a lot of work that can be done there in terms of soils, hedges, trees. How do we integrate trees on farms and so on? And whilst not losing sight of the fact that we've got other issues to think about as well. You know, we have got major issues with like biodiversity decline and so on, and they will need to be addressed. So different answers for different farms, different systems. It's critically important. This is not a debate that is going to go away, or a discussion that is going to go away. It's only going to intensify. It's ultimately to the benefit of everybody, be you a consumer or be you a regulator, but just focusing on carbon is dangerous, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Frisson. If you can just stop sharing, and then everyone put their cameras on. I'd like now to come to both Kevin and Greg, just for some comments, really. And I guess, you know, I meet very few farmers who aren't interested, and in fact, they're really passionate about wanting to think that they're doing a good thing. You know, they love to think that their farms are great places. They're doing the best that they possibly can. I see a lot of interest in these sorts of things, but simplicity is often the key, isn't it, really? You know, I know both of you, Greg and Kevin, you've looked at this a little bit in the past. Give us your views on what you've heard this morning and how what you feel you need to, in a way, position your farms well for the future. Give us some views. Kevin, let's start with you.
Right. All really interesting stuff. I think when it comes to Bristol's bus, I'm probably still on the bus. I'm probably sat somewhere near the back, because if I get off at the wrong stop, it's a long walk to the right stop. Whilst all the scientists are battling over getting the right metrics right and getting the right tools, you know, it's difficult for us to choose the route we go down with. I like what Adele and the Sustainable Food Trust is saying, you know, that holistic approach of environment and food production, and just making it all encompassing, really, because we do all have to eat, and there are you know, minuses to that, but we do want to all survive as a human race and look after the planet as well. You know, the whole thing about, you know, getting lambs away quick is good for the carbon footprint, but we don't want to feed them, you know. And some of the best ingredients for feeds is soya and cereals. But can we use more waste feeds that, you know, the humans don't eat, that we can put into? Okay, it might not be best nutritionally wise. It might even cause more methane. I don't know, but you know, is that better? There's so many questions. And carbon credits, you know, none of us are carbon neutral anyway. So how are we going to have carbon to trade? And then if we trade that carbon, then that make farming not carbon zero because we've traded carbon? I do find it all, and the moral obligations of that, I do find it all a bit confusing, really.
That's some really good points there. Greg, can I come over to you?
Yeah, Phil, I mean, listening to the things, obviously, I took what our first speaker said, the things about, obviously, the peatlands sort of holding 259 tonnes per hectare of carbon. I mean, obviously, where we're at, a large majority of the farm is peatland, moorland. And obviously, there's been a hell of a lot of work done recently in sort of the areas as regards revegetating peat and so on. Sort of on a personal level, it's very difficult. We were part of the Elms test and trial. And to my surprise, we sort of got a tick from the guy that was doing it on the business side of how it sort of all tied in with the business being profitable and also the cost. I think this is the biggest problem, certainly as I feel as an upland hill farm, and obviously the spring, winter we've had, is the cost, the feeding of concentrates to get the sheep into some sort of decent condition to be able to then produce your product, which is your lamb. And it's sort of tying that in with then the carbon emissions or the greenhouse gases and so on. And the weather, unfortunately, plays a massive part in that, whether we like it or not. And obviously on a lot of upland farms, our grass growing season is fairly short. It's probably only April through till November. Then after that, you're sort of into then having to, unfortunately, add feed to the sheep, whether that is silage mainly. I mean, we try to do mainly it's silage and haylage, but unfortunately that has to be bought in and brought on a wagon. But then there is some of the other concentrates. So it's tying it all in and trying to keep that input cost and the carbon footprint as low as possible, while still maintaining a good output. As Kevin said, we all need food in the world. I do feel, unfortunately, the government may be looking to try and do some of this with arms on the cheap. That is my own opinion. I mean, listen to Tony Juniper once give a talk, and basically instead of the £3.5 billion budget the government has talked about, he said probably to fulfil our nature obligations and carbon footprint and so on and so on, he thought it would be near 20 billion. And then my fear is this government may be trying to do some of these things on the cheap.
It's interesting, isn't it? And you're an upland area, Greg. You know, you won't be alone. I get a lot of our sheep systems generally have been under pressure from the market and from trade. But in an upland situation, you know, you could argue that a lot of upland situations have really been pulled away from what would have been very traditional systems in order to fulfill a very modern marketplace and supply chain. And there's always going to be trade-offs, aren't there? You know, if you try and produce a product that can go into a standard lamb supply chain and be exported into export markets, you know, it will be about you adjusting your genetics, which will then have an impact on your feed, on your grassland management, on your carbon footprint. And trying to optimize all those things is really difficult. I was really interested by the one of the slides that you used, Adele, where one of the gains, I think you suggested, one of the gains we could make would be by converting a lot of arable land to grassland. And if that was to happen across the whole of the country, then we're probably going to be looking at utilizing that grassland with grazing animals. You know, a question I'm regularly asked is, what do you see the future for the sheep industry in terms of size or scale? The picture you painted, Adele, you could say, well, our industry could at least maintain its size and scale. It could even expand. If we have more grassland in the whole of the UK, we could expand our industry, but there's going to be subtle changes in both our lowlands and our uplands.
Yeah, I want to sort of talk about that, Phil. I mean, we've seen big changes in the uplands from once of it was always the hill-bred sheep, which obviously now is the swale-tailed. And there's been, even ourselves personally, have moved more into the continental breeds, whether that's a Texel or something like that, because obviously they're more marketable. And we've seen change. I mean, once over going back 20 years or pre-foot and mouth, the breeding sheep in the uplands was king. Whereas now what's happened is people have had to move. There's more people in the world now looking to eat sheep than they are looking to breed sheep. There's only farmers looking to buy breeding sheep. So systems certainly have changed in that respect. But obviously also as a romantic, so to speak, and obviously being vice chairman of the Swaledale Association, we would sort of try to explore the point with our the girl that was running it, of sort of upland sheep running on the moors and obviously this peatland ground. You probably get a more diverse way of grazing from the upland and hill sheep rather than the continental bred sheep. And this was something I wanted to sort of even do trials or explore, to a way of managing our uplands. And was that a way of then making sure that we are then grazing the uplands and peatlands better and keeping those in good condition, rather than the worry of, you know, the continental bred sheep grazing the lower ground and maybe losing that biodiversity further up the hill.
I think you're right as well, Greg. I think we will be using the traditional breeds for, I'll call it conservation grazing, and there'll be, you know, some meat production there, but you'll use those continental breeds that are sort of heavier and sort of faster sort of production, probably in arable situations, because we're looking at, can we increase the amount of grazing on arable land so that you can put grass in as part of the rotation and increase the carbon stocks within the soils. And you know, I think you will see increasingly, you know, sheep in particular, and pigs over on the East Coast. But you've got to put the infrastructure back in. You know, there aren't fences and things to make sure it's stock proof. So that's got to be dealt with as well before we go down that particular route.
It's interesting, isn't it, how you know, our system of stratification evolved for very good reasons, and that's been put under pressure over this last few decades, isn't it? And you know, when you get involved in these sorts of discussions, you do think we could move back towards that stratified system, but then we've got to overcome some of the challenges which drove farmers back in a different direction. You know, some of those health, disease, parasite problems, the trading, equitable trading between store lambs and finishing. Kevin, you were going to come in there. I think I might have butted in. But
you said exactly what I said.
Oh, sorry.
Like stratification to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so often we still feel or see that stratified system coming under pressure, but it came about because of really good environmental sense and resource use sense in many ways.
Yeah, we're working on a really interesting report at the moment, which is effectively a modelling exercise, but basically looking at if we transition to the whole of the UK to so-called sort of regenerative farming, so a reduction in inputs, not totally organic, but a reduction in inputs, regenerative grazing where possible, these sorts of activities. What would we, well, first of all, where would different farming activities take place? And as you said, Phil, that probably means more grasslands as part of rotation in the arable east, potentially more arable production in the west broadly. You know, obviously Wales is not ideal for producing, you know, widespread arable, but there are, you know, loads of areas where you can grow, you know, whether it's feed on farm, oats and peas, these sorts of things. Also fruit and vegetable production scattered more across the whole country. But again, that will require rotation, particularly if we're going to reduce the nitrous oxide emissions from nitrogen fertilizer. So, you know, looking at that whole system and where the different activities might take place in a slightly different way, what food would we produce and in what proportions? And therefore, notionally, and we're not necessarily suggesting we should become self-sufficient as a nation, but notionally, how could we align our diets with the productive capacity of a truly regenerative landscape? And that's really interesting, because it probably means, as a proportion of the meat we eat, more beef and lamb, significant reduction in pork and poultry. So yeah, it's really interesting when you start thinking about what these farming systems are going to have to look like to be net zero, and you know, rather than thinking about how we, you know, live off the fat of the Indonesian rainforest or Californian almond groves. Let's think about living off the fat of our own land and what the farming systems have to look like to support that change. So we're hoping to publish that in the autumn. I think it will provoke quite a lot of conversation, which is good.
No, I look forward to seeing that, actually, because I do think that you know, a lot of farmers are really struggling at the moment in terms of going through such significant change, and yet the vision for where we're going is not yet clear. I mean, maybe you can't expect it to be that clear, but you know, it's really difficult for people to be making informed business decisions where they don't quite know where they're going. And if you look at what's going on at the moment within our government and cabinet about future trade deals, you know, all of that is going to hugely affect our agricultural systems going forward, and it's just not clear at the moment for farmers to be able to make informed decisions. Priscilla, have you got any comments you'd like to make on the discussion over the last few minutes? And I think we want to just dip into the Q&A and just answer a few questions that have come up.
Yeah, I did see one question. Chris Neil asked, which calculator did we use for hill farms? Well, it was the Bangor calculator that we used for us in the study that I to. I think, you know, some really good points made. Just to pick up on what you said, essentially, you know, about reverting back to more mixed systems, which, you know, we talk about these kind of things in well, sometimes groundbreaking terms. We're essentially trying to, in many ways, to turn the clock back to where we were 50 or 60 years ago. And, you know, I think there's a lot to be said for all of that. I think, you know, we do have monocultures essentially of different systems in different parts of the country, and, you know, more sort of integrated mix would be great. However, I'm just not sure about the economics of it all, really. There is a reason why, well, there are a number of different reasons why we have got the farm systems that we have today. If you think about the cost of machinery, for instance, then that is a big driver in specialisation, and, you know, the cost of machinery is only going up. So I'm not sure really how, you know, the hills and upland regions of that we have so many of in the UK, how, you know, many of those farms could justify going back and bringing back a sort of arable rotation into their system and so on. I think there are lots of things against integrated systems. You know, I would love to see more mixed farming systems, but I think there are lots of reasons why we've got ourselves. Policy, no doubt, has a huge role to play in this, and, you know, that's where policy will need to be especially strong, because it's not going to happen by itself. You know, not, and I think in terms of diet change and so on, people are used to choice, aren't they? I mean, how do you tell a retailer, well, actually, no, we're not going to allow you to import avocados from California, whatever, when their consumers expect it, and there's no such thing as seasons almost in the supermarket these days. You know, we've got the same products on the shelves almost every day of the year. So how we turn the clock back and all of that, I do not know. I mean, there's talk about tagging and so on, but I think it'll be a carrot and stick approach, because it's not going to happen just through goodwill.
John, here's a question from well, an anonymous attendee around carbon offsetting. You've probably seen that, but with carbon offsetting trading, I believe we need to demonstrate additionality over and above what we've got at the moment, I guess. So without massively changing my farming system, how can I achieve this? I can see it would be easier for an arable farm to demonstrate this, but as I already have a carbon sink in terms of grassland, I assume it's harder to change.
Yeah, and this is a very good point. It is quite hard to demonstrate additionality, and I've got to say the standards aren't, you know, brilliant there. That, you know, the Woodland Code and the Peatland Code are really the only two sort of offsetting schemes that talk about additionality and do so robustly. I think this goes back to the need to set a baseline, and again, using a carbon tool, one that suits you, one maybe that your supply chain are asking you to use, and build that baseline so you've got evidence from where you're starting, and then you can show that, you know, whatever you've done to improve that carbon stock is additional to what maybe you were planning to do anyhow. is really the only way to go. I would also say, you know, there's a lot of talk about carbon offsetting at the moment. And I suppose my sort of key word is enter them with caution. It's a bit like the Wild West at the moment. And, you know, peatland code, woodland code, they're pretty good, but there are lots of people offering all sorts of opportunities. And, you know, they're dangling some, you know, big money. But what you've got to ask yourself is, how long are you looking yourself in for? What have you got to evidence? If whatever you're offering in terms of an offset is lost, what are the liabilities for you as a farmer? Because it's not a one-way street, you know, and you need to be absolutely clear what you're entering into. Otherwise, I think you could find yourself sat with a large liability. So, you know, be careful if you're considering that. I think the opportunities for offsets will grow in the future, and it may be, again, worth sitting and waiting on that particular opportunity.
Good, thanks, John. Adele, I think you've answered that question, haven't you, about piloting and trialing the global farm metrics? Did you answer that online?
Yes, if anyone wants to have a go at the self-assessment tool, it's currently an Excel spreadsheet effectively. We are working on developing it into a web-based platform, which will make it a lot easier for you to put the information into. So that will, you know, be coming soon. But if anyone wants to have a go at the Excel version, please do email me. It's fairly simple to use. I'll be happy to provide an explanation.
Thanks, Adele. Jan's made the point there that we picked up on a little while ago, that a lot of what we've been talking about creates a good argument for maintaining increasing stratified sheep systems. Another one from anonymous attendee: how does the drive from Natural England to remove sheep from the upland hills in winter, and therefore sheep having to be taken away to be off-wintered, balance with reducing carbon output of farms?
Well, if I can just come in there, it's a good question. The carbon footprint should take that into account, because while those animals have left the farm, they are still part of the agricultural system. But it's a really good question, but a good carbon footprint tool should take that into account.
Great, thank you. Another question from the same person, I think. A lack of experience and knowledge within government is leading to stalled decision-making re-policy. I believe it's holding agriculture back. Again, I think probably we would all agree with that. And I think it's something that the NSA and a whole host of other organisations are working with government on. And then will more grassland and arable systems enable pressures on overgrazed uplands to be reduced? Well, again, that comes back to that balanced stratified system, doesn't it, really? I mean, you know, I think so much of what we've talked about leads us towards trying to optimize everything we do in terms of productivity and environmental management, not maximize. And it is about getting that balance. And that balance will be different between farms. It won't all be the same. But
I suppose it's also, sorry.
Can I just say that as farmers, you know, we've followed the schemes, you know, the DEFRA have set the common agricultural policies. We produce food like we've been told to produce. We're not bad people. We've just been steered down these directions from, you know, government policy over the years, and now it's changing to more environmental, which is fine, but margins are tight. So if any of these are going to be successful, then we need funding from somewhere. You know, there's lots of things that we would all love to have done in the past, environmentally and sustainable, but without income, we can't do it.
Could I just add to Kevin's point there? I mean, there was briefly touched on there about upland farmers sending sheep into lowlands if there's more grassland in the arable. I mean, that is happening anyway now. I know 1 or 2 farms round about that are sending the sheep to Lincolnshire for the winter, and obviously, hopefully, reduced cost if all of a sudden this feed is going to keep ramping up like it is at the moment. That's going to be an option that a lot of upland farmers are looking at. But the one thing I can say at the present moment in time, obviously, there's almost a big disparity between upland farms and lowland farms. When I look at somebody like Kevin, who will be a lot more intensive than we are, which is more an extensive system, it's going to create almost a two-tiered system on the elm side of it. But what I can say, talking to a lot of upland guys, is they're looking at it at the moment and think, well, if I'm running, like for instance, we are 700 ewes, and all of a sudden I'm going to be paid through elms to do more environmental work, I can see the national flock, or certainly in the uplands flocks, reducing by 10%, because people are going to follow where the money is at, and they're going to adapt. And it's as simple as that. I know we've done some work with some flooding work with Environment Agency recently, and we've actually done some of the work ourselves as a way of creating an income. And in some respects, it's better paying than looking after sheep. So I can see more and more farmers, certainly uplands, looking at that, and probably we could easily end up with a reduced national flock, certainly in the uplands anyway. I don't know how the lowland guys would view it. I can see some people on better farms actually going the other way and actually becoming more intensive and actually doing more damage to the environment than actually what the government is hoping, they're hoping to reverse it.
Well, that's the law of unintended consequences sometimes, isn't it, really?
But I think that raises an important point. You know, I think the uplands will end up doing far more in terms of those sort of environmental scheme opportunities. But we've got to remember that no single farm has to be carbon neutral. And so, you know, it may be that in certain areas, in particular the uplands, you know, a group of farmers come together to access the Tier 3 ELMS money to enable them to, you know, develop a range of opportunities for environmental enhancements, which then gives them all a more sustainable income rather than just doing it on their own as well. And so I think we will potentially see that happening in those areas. And then in the lowlands, I think you will see more intensification of, you know, sheep and other sort of livestock sectors. And maybe, you know, environmentally that's also appropriate, but it gives them options to again balance what they're doing collectively across their farm. So we shouldn't get too het up by, can I get my farm to carbon neutral? The answer is probably not.
I think that's a really good point as well, John, because if you look at those two upper tiers of ELMS, I guess local nature recovery and landscape recovery, that is where you're going to see clusters of farmers working together more in catchment type arrangements. And I think what you've described there is quite likely and quite possible, actually. And it will be about farmers looking at the resources and their own interests and their resources for their farms and how it fits in with others within those catchment areas.
And what we've got to remember in all of this, of course, is you know, the level of uptake, as Kevin explained very, very well. I mean, ultimately, farmers have to make good business decisions, and the level of uptake of any new scheme will depend a lot on what happens to the market. Yeah. And you know, at the moment, you know, selling just say for £130, I mean, it would take it would need an incentive for him not to produce more. Yeah. You know, so the market is not developed policy at all. And who knows where the markets will go when we do see the sort of post-Brexit trading world, but it's still too early. But I think a lot of talk about policy and a lot of talk about markets, but the two things very much influence each other, and yeah, you know, probably policymakers need to be more aware of that.
Okay, well, it's 10 to 10, so we ought to wrap up. We could have kept this going for a lot longer, I think. And you know, from those last comments, Priester, I think we all recognise that we're living in a really volatile world where there's a lot of uncertainties about where we're heading. It's really important for people to engage with these topics. And I'm you know, personally, I'm really assured by the fact that we've got organisations like all of yours, you know, AHDB, Sustainable Food Trust, Bangor University, many others out there that are working to try to help to position our industry for its own good and security in the future. You know, if we are going to succeed, and we will do, but you know, as we succeed in the future, it's going to be through building a really strong and trustworthy reputation, both here and overseas as well, and backing that up with good, solid information. So the work that you're all doing, I think, is much appreciated, and it's a moving feast. You know, we're not there yet, as everyone said, got a long way to go yet, but it's also great to see, you know, you all and other people working together for a very common shared aims and objectives. So thank you very much for giving your time this morning, and just to mention that our next NSA Breakfast Club is scheduled for the 7th of July. At the moment, keep an eye on the topics for anyone who's interested, but at the moment we're thinking that we might just have a review on life 6 months after our exit from the EU. It wouldn't be a bad thing just to take stock at where we are and what progress we've made and what's going on out there. So please keep an eye open for that on our NSA website and via social media, and link in if you can. So thank you very much for all of our presenters today, and to Kevin and Greg for joining us as well, and for everyone who's joined in and participated. And I wish you a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.